My sister said the house was already hers. She never saw the second deed. I want to tell you about the day I stood in my father's kitchen, still wearing the black dress from his funeral, and listened to my sister tell me that the house I grew up in, the house where I had spent the last 6 years of my life caring for a dying man, was no longer something we needed to discuss. She said it so calmly. She said it the way you'd tell someone the mail had already been picked up. It's already handled, Claire. The house is mine. Dad wanted it that way. And she smiled at me like she was doing me a favor by not making me ask. I didn't argue that day. I want you to understand that about me before I go any further because it matters later. I am not a person who raises her voice. I did not grow up in a house where raising your voice got you anything except a longer silence afterward. So when Melissa said those words to me, standing in the kitchen where I had made my father's oatmeal every single morning for 6 years, measuring it exactly the way his doctor told me to, I just nodded. I said, okay. And I went upstairs to the room that used to be mine when I was 14 years old, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I let myself feel for exactly 10 minutes like the floor had opened up underneath me. Then I stood up because there were still sympathy casseroles to put away and relatives to say goodbye to, and grief, I have learned, does not wait for convenient moments. It just sits there next to you while you keep doing the next necessary thing. My name is Claire. I was 41 years old the week my father died, and for 6 of those years I had lived in his house, in the small guest room down the hall from the room where his hospital bed eventually replaced his old queen mattress, taking care of a man who had raised 2 daughters very differently. My sister Melissa was 3 years older than me, and she had left for the city the week she turned 18 and never really came back, not in any way that counted. She called on holidays. She sent flowers when our mother died. She visited maybe 4 times a year, always for a weekend, always leaving Sunday afternoon with a hug that felt like something she'd read about in a magazine rather than something she actually meant. I don't say any of this to make her sound like a villain, not yet. People do what they do for their own reasons, and I've had a lot of time since then to think about what her reasons might have been. But I need you to understand the shape of our family, because the shape of it is what made everything that happened afterward almost invisible to everyone except me. My father, Walter, was a quiet man. He had worked 32 years at the same manufacturing plant, the kind of job that doesn't exist much anymore, and he had bought that house in 1979 with money he'd saved dollar by dollar in an envelope in his sock drawer, or so the story went every time he told it, which was often, usually after his second cup of coffee on a Sunday. He loved that house in the specific, unglamorous way that men of his generation loved things they had worked for. He knew which floorboard in the hallway creaked. He knew exactly how long it took the water heater to warm up in winter. When his hands started shaking too badly to hold a hammer, and his memory started slipping in ways that scared both of us, I was the one who moved in. Not because anyone forced me. Because I looked at Melissa's life in the city, her marketing job, her husband, her 2 kids in private school, and I looked at my own life, recently divorced, no children, working remotely as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, and I understood without anyone saying it out loud that I was the one with room to give. So I gave it. 6 years of it. I drove him to appointments. I learned to read his moods the way you learn to read weather, the particular stillness in his face that meant a bad day was coming, the way his hands would flatten against his knees when he was trying to remember a word that wouldn't come. I sat with him at 3 in the morning more times than I can count, when the confusion got bad and he thought my mother was still alive and calling for her from the next room. I did not do this because I expected anything. I want to be honest about that. I did it because he was my father, and because somebody had to, and because I loved him in the tired, unglamorous, unremarkable way you love someone you've spent years quietly serving. Melissa visited. She really did, and I don't want to erase that from the story because it would be easy to. But her visits were different. She would arrive with gift bags and leave within 48 hours, always with some reason that made sense on its own but that, stacked up over 6 years, started to form a pattern I tried not to notice. And every visit, at some point, she and my father would disappear into his study for 20 minutes, 30 minutes, sometimes longer, and I never asked what they talked about because it wasn't my business and because I trusted stupidly that whatever it wasn't something that would hurt me. He died on a Tuesday in March in the hospital bed in the room that used to be the dining room with his hand in mine and the television on low, playing an old western he liked, the sound turned down so far it was almost just the shape of dialogue rather than actual words. Melissa arrived 4 hours after he passed. I remember that detail with a strange, sharp precision, the way grief burns certain small facts into you forever. For hours. I had already called the funeral home. I had already washed his face with a warm cloth, the way I'd read somewhere you're supposed to do, out of some old instinct toward tenderness that I didn't examine too closely at the time. The funeral was small, the way he would have wanted it. And it was at the reception afterward, 3 days later, with the casserole dishes still lined up on the kitchen counter and the smell of coffee and cut flowers thick in every room, that Melissa pulled me aside and told me the house was hers. I asked her what she meant. I remember my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to. She said Dad had told her more than once that he wanted the house to go to her because she'd always loved it more, because it was where she'd grown up and where she wanted her own kids to have memories someday because, and this is the part that still sits like a stone in my chest when I think about it, because I would understand since I'd never really needed the house the way she did. I had no children. I had no husband. What did I need a house for? I did not say anything cruel back to her. I want that on the record even now. I asked her quietly if there was something in writing. She said there was a will, that Dad had updated it 2 years ago with a lawyer in town, and that everything was clean and legal and there was nothing to worry about. She said this while refilling her coffee, not even looking at me, like the conversation was already over before it had properly begun. I said okay. And that was the first lie I told that week, because it was not okay, not even a little bit, but I didn't have the words yet, and more than that, I didn't have the proof. That night, after everyone had left and the house had gone quiet in that specific, ringing way houses go quiet after a funeral, I sat at my father's desk in his study, the room where he and Melissa used to disappear together during her visits, and I started looking through his files. Not because I suspected anything specific yet. I told myself I was just being responsible, gathering paperwork the way you're supposed to when a parent dies. Insurance policies. Bank statements. The deed to the house, which I found in a manila folder labeled, in my father's careful handwriting, house. I want to walk you through what I found in that folder slowly, because it unfolded slowly for me too, one document at a time, over the course of that first long night alone in his study with only the desk lamp on and the wind pushing against the old windows. The first thing I found was a copy of the will Melissa had mentioned. It was dated 2 years earlier, and it did in fact leave the house to her. My stomach dropped reading it, even though some small stubborn part of me had already braced for it. It was typed on letterhead from a law office downtown, a firm I didn't recognize, signed by my father in his shaky, familiar handwriting, notarized, everything appearing correct on its face. But something about it nagged at me. My father was a meticulous man, even as his mind began to fail him. He kept receipts for everything. He labeled his files with dates going back decades. And yet this will, this document that reassigned the largest asset of his entire life, was sitting loose in a folder with no other supporting paperwork. No letters from the lawyer. No notes. No drafts. It was just there, clean and final, like it had been placed rather than accumulated. I kept digging. Underneath the will, I found older bank statements going back about 18 months, and something caught my eye that I almost missed at first, a series of transfers, 4 of them, each for exactly $9,500, moved out of my father's savings account and into an account I didn't recognize. $9,500. Not $10,000. I remember sitting back in his chair when I noticed that, feeling something cold move through me, because I knew from my own work as a bookkeeper, that $10,000 is the threshold banks are required to flag and report. Someone had known that too. I did not sleep that night. I sat at that desk until the sky outside the window went from black to gray, going through drawer after drawer, folder after folder, trying to build a timeline in my head. My father's cognitive decline had become noticeable around 3 years before he died, according to the notes from his doctor, which I found in a separate folder, notes I had actually helped compile myself because I was the one who took him to those appointments. The will was dated 2 years before his death. The transfers began 18 months before his death. Every piece of this was happening in the window of time when his memory was already slipping, when he sometimes couldn't remember what day it was, when he once called me by my mother's name and looked confused when I gently corrected him. I am not a naturally suspicious person. I want to say that again because I think it matters for you to understand how long it took me to let myself see what was actually in front of me. I loved my sister. I had grown up sharing a room with her until I was 9 years old. I remembered her teaching me to ride a bike in the driveway of that same house, running alongside me with her hand hovering an inch from the seat, ready to catch me. It took real deliberate effort for me to let the shape of what I was finding become a shape I could actually name. The next morning I called the law firm listed on the will. I didn't tell Melissa I was doing this. I told myself I was just handling the estate paperwork, which was technically true since I had been named the executor in an older will, one from years before, the same one that had left the house to me and Melissa jointly split 50-50, a will I had actually seen before back when my father first drew it up after my mother's death. The receptionist at the law firm put me through to a paralegal, who told me, politely but firmly, that they had no record of ever preparing a will for a Walter Henley. I gave her the date on the document. I gave her the case number printed at the bottom. She checked and checked again and told me with a kind of careful professional discomfort I could hear even through the phone, that the case number didn't correspond to anything in their system, and that the letterhead, while it looked similar to theirs, wasn't actually their current template, which had changed the year before the document was supposedly drafted. I sat with that information for a long moment after I hung up. I remember looking out the study window at the backyard, at the old maple tree my father had planted the year I was born, and feeling something shift inside me that wasn't quite anger yet. It was closer to grief. A second grief underneath the first one, for a version of my sister I had apparently never really known. I could have confronted Melissa right then. Some part of me wanted to, the raw, wounded part that wanted to call her and demand an explanation before I lost my nerve. But I didn't, and I'm glad I didn't, because what I did instead was something my father, in his quiet, methodical way, had actually taught me without either of us realizing it at the time. He used to say that if you're going to accuse someone of something, you'd better be holding more proof than they're holding excuses. I decided I needed more before I said a single word. I went to the county recorder's office 3 days later, on a Thursday, telling Melissa I had errands to run for the estate, which again was technically true. I asked to see the full deed history for the property, every filing associated with the address going back to 1979. The clerk, an older woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, pulled up the records for me on her computer, and then went into the back to retrieve some older documents that hadn't been digitized. Took almost 40 minutes. I sat in a hard plastic chair in that fluorescent-lit office and felt my heart doing something strange and uneven in my chest the entire time. When she came back, she had a thin folder with 2 documents inside it, and it was the second one that changed everything. The first was the original deed from 1979, exactly as I expected, my father's name only, since he'd bought the house before he was even married. Unremarkable. What I hadn't expected, what I don't think I ever would have found if I hadn't specifically asked for the complete filing history rather than just the most recent record, was a second deed filed only 14 months before my father died, quietly, without any announcement, without any family conversation that I had ever been part of. This second deed added a name to the property title. Not Melissa's name. Mine. I read it 3 times standing right there at the counter, because I genuinely did not trust my own eyes. My father had filed a deed adding me as joint tenant with right of survivorship on the house, 14 months before he died, at a point when, according to his medical records, his cognition was already declining, but he still had, according to the same doctor's notes, periods of clarity that his physician had specifically documented as sufficient for him to understand and execute legal decisions. The deed was notarized by a notary I didn't recognize, a woman named Patricia Ruiz, whose stamp and signature were both clean and legible at the bottom of the page. I asked the clerk if I could get a certified copy. She said yes, of course, and while she processed it, I sat back down in that hard plastic chair and I cried quietly, the kind of crying you do when you're trying very hard not to disturb the people around you. Not because I was sad. Because somewhere in the fog of his last 2 years, somewhere in the confusion and the shaking hands and the moments he forgot my name, my father had done something clear-eyed and deliberate to protect me, and he had never told me, and I would never get the chance to ask him why or to thank him. I drove home with that certified copy sitting on the passenger seat like it was something fragile. And for the first time since the funeral, I let myself actually think about what this meant. If this second deed was valid, then legally, upon my father's death, I automatically became the sole owner of the house the moment he died, through the right of survivorship, regardless of whatever the will said, because a deed naming a joint tenant supersedes a will's instructions about the same property. Melissa's will, real or fabricated, real or forged, didn't matter anymore, not for the house specifically, because you cannot will away property you no longer solely own. But I still didn't fully understand why. Why hadn't he told me? Why had he gone through the trouble of adding me to the deed instead of simply changing the will back? And why 14 months before his death had he apparently trusted a notary and a filing clerk more than he trusted a conversation with his own daughters? I found part of my answer 4 days later, going through a box of his things in the hall closet that I hadn't yet had the strength to open, a box with old photographs and a few of his personal letters, the kind of things you save without quite knowing why. Tucked into a manila envelope near the bottom, I found a letter handwritten, dated the same month as the second deed, addressed to me, that he had apparently never sent. I'm not going to read it to you word for word because some things belong only to the person who received them, and I think you'll understand why I want to keep at least this much for myself. But I can tell you the shape of what it said. He wrote that he'd noticed things, that he'd found paperwork in his own desk that he didn't remember signing, that Melissa had visited more that year than she had in the previous 5 combined, always disappearing into his study, always leaving him feeling foggy and unsettled afterward in a way he couldn't fully explain even to himself. He wrote that he was scared of what was happening to his own mind, and scared that he wouldn't be able to trust his own judgment much longer, and that he wanted to do one thing while he still could that no one could take back or twist around later. He wrote that he loved us both, that he wasn't trying to punish anyone, that he just wanted to make sure the daughter who had actually stayed, who had actually shown up, who had held his hand through the worst of it would never end up with nothing. He never sent that letter. Maybe he forgot. Maybe he changed his mind about needing to explain himself. Maybe, and this is the thought that actually brings me the most peace now, he simply trusted that the deed itself would speak for him when the time came, that he didn't need to explain a decision that was, in its own quiet way, completely clear. I sat on the floor of that hallway for a long time with the letter in my lap. And then, because grief and clarity apparently live very close together, I started thinking practically again. I needed to understand the will. I needed to understand the transfers. I needed to understand who Patricia Ruiz, the notary, actually was, and whether she could confirm anything about the circumstances of that deed being signed. I found her 3 days later. Small towns make some things easier. She worked out of a strip mall office that also did tax preparation, and when I called and explained who I was, she remembered my father immediately, which surprised me until she explained why. She told me that he had come in alone, driven by a neighbor whose name I recognized, an older man named Frank who used to play cards with him on Wednesdays, and that he had been, in her professional assessment, entirely lucid that day. She said he'd told her, unprompted, while she was preparing the paperwork, that he wanted to make sure his younger daughter was taken care of because she was the one who'd shown up for him, and that he'd said it with a kind of quiet certainty that she remembered specifically because it wasn't the kind of thing people usually announce to a notary they've just met. She said she'd made a note of the date and his demeanor in her own log, standard practice for older clients, precisely because she wanted a record in case anyone ever questioned his competency later. She still had that log. She offered, without my even asking, to provide a sworn statement if it ever came to that. I thanked her and hung up the phone and sat in my car in the strip mall parking lot for a long time, feeling something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt since before my father got sick. Not triumph exactly. Something quieter than that. Something closer to being seen even secondhand, even after the fact, by the one person whose seeing had mattered most to me my whole life. But I still hadn't confronted Melissa, and I still didn't fully understand the fake will, or the transfers, or what exactly she had been doing during those long conversations in the study. I decided I needed one more piece before I said anything to her at all, because I wanted to understand not just when. I called Frank, the neighbor who had driven my father to the notary's office. He was in his 70s, a little hard of hearing, and delighted to hear from me, the way older men often are when you call just to ask them about their memories rather than to sell them something. He told me that my father had asked him for that ride specifically, and had asked him, oddly, not to mention it to Melissa if she called or visited, which Frank had thought was strange at the time but hadn't questioned, because it wasn't his business. He also told me something I hadn't expected. He said that about 2 months before that, Melissa had actually approached him separately, asking whether he'd be willing to serve as a witness for some paperwork my father needed to sign, paperwork Frank never actually ended up witnessing, because when he showed up on the agreed day, Melissa told him it wasn't necessary anymore, that they'd found someone else. I asked him if he remembered anything else. He said only that Melissa had seemed nervous that day, which he remembered specifically because it was unlike her, because in his experience she always seemed so composed. I want to be honest with you about something. By this point I had enough. I had the deed. I had the notary's testimony. I had the letter my father wrote and never sent. I could have gone straight to a lawyer, quietly secured everything, and simply informed Melissa, coldly and legally, that the house was mine and there was nothing left to discuss. Some part of me, the part still raw from that conversation in the kitchen, wanted exactly that. I wanted her to feel, for even a moment, the same blindsided helplessness I had felt. But I didn't do that. I want to tell you why, because I think it's the part of this story that actually matters most. I still didn't understand what had happened to that money. 4 transfers of $9,500 each, $38,000 total, moved out of my father's account and into one I didn't recognize. I couldn't reconcile that with the version of Melissa I still, despite everything, wanted to believe existed somewhere underneath whatever had happened. So before I confronted her, I did what I do professionally, the thing I'm actually good at. I traced the money. It took 2 weeks and a very patient bank representative who I'm fairly certain bent a few rules to help me, given that I was the executor of the estate and technically entitled to request certain records under that authority. The account those transfers had gone into belonged to a company, not a person, an LLC registered 18 months earlier under the name Hillcrest Renovations. I looked up the LLC's registration. The registered agent was a lawyer's office downtown, a different firm than the fake one on the fraudulent will. The listed owner, buried 2 layers deep in the filing, in a section most people never bother reading, was Melissa. I sat with that for a long time too. I called a friend of mine, a real estate agent named Denise I'd known since high school, and asked her carefully, without explaining why, whether she'd heard anything about a company called Hillcrest Renovations. She had. She told me, somewhat surprised that I was asking, that Hillcrest had done a small flip about a year earlier, a modest 3-bedroom on the other side of town, bought for cheap and renovated and resold for a solid profit. She said she remembered it specifically because the renovation budget had seemed unusually generous for a first project, and she'd wondered at the time where the startup capital had come from. I finally understood. My sister hadn't been visiting our father for those long private conversations out of love, or at least not only out of love. She had been slowly, carefully, convincing a man whose mind was already beginning to fail him to fund her business, $38,000 at a time, kept conveniently under the reporting threshold, and she had, at some point in that same window, arranged for a will to be drafted that would give her the house too, on top of everything else, likely intending to sell it and fold that money into her growing venture as well. Whether she'd forged the will herself or paid someone else to produce it, I still don't fully know to this day, and honestly I've stopped needing to know. What I know is enough. I want to pause here and tell you something about how I felt in that moment, sitting in my father's study with all of this laid out in front of me, because I think it's different from what you might expect. I did not feel rage, not the hot kind anyway. I felt something more like exhaustion, the specific exhaustion of finally understanding a shape you've been sensing in the dark for a long time. And underneath that exhaustion, I felt something that surprised me even more. I felt sorry for her. Not enough to excuse what she'd done, but enough to understand that somewhere along the way she had convinced herself this was fine, that she deserved it, that I would understand that I didn't need the house the way she did. People rarely think of themselves as villains in their own story. I think Melissa had built an entire private narrative where taking this was simply hers to take, and where I, quiet, dutiful, childless me, was somehow the version of the two of us who needed less. I called a lawyer, finally an actual one, whose name I found through a referral from Patricia Ruiz herself, who seemed genuinely invested in seeing this handled properly. His name was Mr. Aldrich, an older man with a slow, careful way of speaking that reminded me a little of my father. I brought him everything. The second deed. The letter. The notary's account. Frank's account. The bank records. The LLC filing. He listened to all of it without interrupting, and when I finished, he sat back in his chair and told me, quite plainly, that I had one of the cleanest cases of undue influence and probable fraud he'd seen in years, and that the second deed alone was likely enough to settle the ownership question outright, without even needing to touch the will at all. He asked me what I wanted to do. And this is the part where I think this story might surprise you, because I didn't ask him to sue her. I didn't ask him to have her arrested, though he told me gently that the transfers alone could constitute financial elder abuse under state law if I wanted to pursue that path. I sat there for a long moment, thinking about my father's letter, About the way he'd written that he wasn't trying to punish anyone, only trying to make sure I wouldn't end up with nothing. And I decided that whatever I did next needed to honor that, not my anger. I asked him to draft a simple, clear letter laying out everything: the deed, the fraudulent will, the notary statement, the LLC, the transfers, and to send it not to a courtroom, but to Melissa directly, along with a request that we meet, just the two of us, before anything became public or legal in a way that couldn't be undone. She agreed to meet 3 days later at the house. I remember choosing that specifically, the kitchen, the same room where she told me so casually that the house was already hers. I wanted her to hear the truth in the same place she told me the lie. She arrived looking tired in a way I hadn't noticed at the funeral, dressed more plainly than usual, and I could tell the moment she walked in that she already suspected something was wrong, because I had not told her what this meeting was about, only that we needed to talk about the estate. I didn't raise my voice. I want you to picture this the way it actually happened, because it wasn't dramatic, not in the way you might expect from everything that led up to it. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd fed our father his oatmeal for 6 years, and I laid the documents out one at a time, slowly, giving her a moment with each one before moving to the next. I started with the deed. I watched her face when she saw it, and I understood immediately that she hadn't known, that Dad really had kept this from both of us, a secret held close and quiet until the moment it mattered most. Her face went pale, then confused. Then, as she kept reading, something harder, something more defensive. I told her about the fake will next, watching her very carefully as I explained what the paralegal had told me. She didn't deny it immediately. She looked down at the table for a long moment, and then she said quietly that she'd found a lawyer online who handled things fast and cheap, and that she hadn't realized or hadn't let herself realize how irregular it all was. I didn't push on that. I let it sit. Then I told her about the transfers, about Hillcrest renovations, about the flip house Denise had told me about. I watched something in her collapse when I said the name of the LLC out loud, because she understood in that moment that I hadn't just found one piece of this. I had found the whole shape of it. She cried. Not performative crying. Real, exhausted, cornered crying, the kind that comes when someone finally stops holding a story together. She told me that her business had been failing quietly for 2 years, that she'd taken out loans she couldn't repay, that she'd been terrified of admitting any of it to her husband, that Dad had noticed she was struggling during one of her visits and had offered to help, at first with smaller amounts, and that somewhere along the way, as his memory got worse, the offering had turned into something closer to asking, and then closer still to arranging, in ways she said she now understood were wrong, but that had felt at the time like something she was owed rather than something she was taking. I didn't argue with her account of her own guilt or innocence. I wasn't there to extract a confession for its own sake. I told her calmly what Mr. Aldrich had told me, that I had every legal right to pursue this as elder financial abuse, that the deed alone settled the house question regardless of anything else, and that I had chosen, so far, not to involve the courts or the police, not because she deserved that mercy exactly, but because our father had asked in his own quiet way, for this not to become a war. I told her what I actually wanted. I wanted the $38,000 repaid on a schedule Mr. Aldrich and I would set, not as punishment but as restoration, because that money had come from a man who could no longer choose to give it away with a clear mind, and it needed to go back to where it had come from, into the estate we were still, technically, splitting according to everything else that was fair. I wanted her to withdraw any claim to the house entirely, in writing, notarized this time by someone neither of us had ever met before. And I told her, and I meant this more than anything else I said that day, that I wanted her to understand why Dad had done what he did, not as an accusation, but as a fact she needed to sit with. He hadn't chosen me over her out of favoritism. He had chosen me because I was the one who showed up every single day for 6 years without asking what I would get for it. That wasn't a competition I had won. It was simply what had actually happened. She agreed to everything. I think in some strange way, she was relieved to finally not be carrying the secret anymore. We didn't hug at the end of that conversation. I want to be honest about that too, because this isn't a story where everything resolves into warmth just because the truth finally came out. But we didn't scream at each other either. We sat there, 2 tired women in our 40s, at our dead father's kitchen table, and we agreed quietly on a way forward that didn't require destroying each other. It's been almost a year now since that conversation. Melissa has repaid about half of what she owes, in steady, unremarkable installments that show up in the estate account on the 15th of every month, like a small, ongoing apology that doesn't need words attached to it. Her business, as far as I know, is winding down quietly, and she's taken a regular job again, something with more stability, less risk. We talk occasionally, carefully, the way people talk when they're rebuilding something that broke in a way neither of them fully expected. It isn't what it used to be. I don't know if it ever will be. But it isn't nothing either. I still live in the house. I go into my father's study some evenings and I sit at his desk, and sometimes I take out that letter he never sent me, and I read it again, not because I need the reminder of what happened, but because I like hearing his voice in my head one more time, careful and a little formal and completely, quietly certain of what he wanted for me. I think about what would have happened if I hadn't asked that clerk for the full filing history instead of just the most recent one. If I had simply accepted, in that kitchen 3 days after the funeral, that the house was already hers, the way she said it so casually, like there was nothing left to check. I think about how close I came to believing her, out of grief, out of exhaustion, out of the old worn habit of not making waves in a family that had never rewarded me for making them. But I didn't believe her. I looked instead. And underneath the story she told me, there was another story entirely, one my father had written quietly, in ink and notary stamps and one unsent letter, a story that had been waiting patiently in a county records office for someone to come looking for it. He never got to tell me himself. But in the end he didn't need to. He'd already told me everything I needed to know, in the only language he trusted completely by the end, the language of paper that couldn't be talked over, couldn't be softened into someone else's version of events, couldn't be taken from me the way so many other things almost were. The house is quiet most evenings now. I still know which floorboard creaks in the hallway. I still know exactly how long the water heater takes to warm up in winter. And some nights, sitting in the kitchen where all of this finally came apart and then slowly began to come back together, I think I can almost hear him telling me, in that same steady voice he used every Sunday over his second cup of coffee, that he always knew exactly what he was doing.